You've probably seen hover effects like this a lot. When you hover over an image, some related info pops up. They're super handy for things like a Meet the Team section with a flip effect, or an Our Services section where an image slides into view. But what if the details we want to show shouldn't appear in the same box, but instead somewhere else in the layout? You'd probably say, let's just move the info to that spot in the HTML. But here's the catch. We can't change the HTML. So then the next thought might be, all right, let's use JavaScript to duplicate some nodes at runtime. But what if JavaScript isn't an option either? I recently worked on a project where I wanted to keep an image and its related content inside the same parent to maintain clean and semantic code. At the same time, I didn't want to duplicate anything, either by hard coding or by using JavaScript. That sounds a bit tricky, and that's exactly what we're going to solve in this video using only CSS. Welcome to Optimistic Web, where we explore the world of CSS and front-end development, one step at a time. Let's quickly walk through the markup. We have a section with a CSS class on it, and inside there are a bunch of child elements. What we're doing here is that the very first child displays a default heading and some content. This is the exact spot where we'll reveal the details connected to each image. The rest of the siblings each contain an image along with the related content for that specific image. Like I said earlier, every image and its details are grouped inside the same parent. We won't duplicate anything in the HTML, and we won't use JavaScript either. Now let's jump into the CSS. It already has some basic rules for layout and typography. We'll start with the section element that has the team's CSS class. This will be a grid container with 5 equal width columns. The maximum width is set to 62.5 rem, and the left and right margins are set to auto so the whole section stays centered. Next up is team info, which is the placeholder for the default heading and also the area where the revealing info will appear. This is styled as a flex container, with both justify content and align items set to center, plus some presentational styles. Now the layout is designed in such a way that this area spans across 4 grid cells. That means it starts at the first row grid line and the first column grid line, and it ends at the third row grid line and the third column grid line. Let's bring up the dev tools so we can easily visualize the layout. As we can see, it stretches from line 1 to line 3 on both axes, basically covering a 2x2 block or 4 grid cells. And then the images automatically flow into the next available cells in the grid. Let's style the image so it fully covers its grid cell. We'll set both the width and height to 100% and use Object Fit Cover to maintain its width to height ratio intact while still covering the entire box. And for the hover effect, we'll use the after pseudo element on the anchor tag. So first of all, this should have absolute positioning, and then the inset 0 will make it cover the whole cell. That's basically the same as individually setting top, right, bottom, and left to 0. After that, we'll add a semi-transparent background and keep it hidden by default with opacity and visibility settings. When we hover over the image, the pseudo element will come to life. Right now, it's stretching across the full browser window because we haven't defined its positioning context yet. So let's add position relative to the anchor tag. The extra space you see below the image is actually the content tied to each image, so don't worry about that, we'll fix it soon. Now comes the real challenge of positioning the image content inside the leftmost grid area. We'll start by giving it position absolute and an inset of 1.5 rem. Let's add a temporary border to mark out its boundaries. Just like with the anchor element, this also needs a positioning context. In this case, we can use the section element and set it to position relative. And just like that, the image content is now locked inside the overall block. But that's still not what we're looking for. Our goal is to align it with the leftmost colored box, and that's as simple as defining a grid area in CSS Grid layout. In our example, we can reuse the same grid area coordinates we used for the green box, or make it even simpler by just using the grid column property with starting and ending grid lines. We copied the same grid area values because we simply wanted to place them in the exact same spot, but we're free to use different values if the design calls for it. For instance, Setting grid column to 3 by 5 would move the content into a different area of the grid. Now normally, CSS grid properties like grid column and grid row only apply to direct children of the grid container. But in our case, the member details element is actually a child of team member, not of the grid container itself. So you'd expect the grid properties to have no effect. However, when we apply position absolute to an element, it's taken out of the normal document flow. Instead of positioning itself relative to its immediate parent, it positions itself relative to the nearest positioned ancestor, in this case, the grid container. According to the CSS grid layout spec, if an absolutely positioned element's containing block is generated by a grid container, that containing block corresponds to the grid area defined by its grid placement properties. In simple words, if we have an absolutely positioned element inside a grid container, and that grid container provides the positioning context, then we can use grid placement properties like grid area, grid column, and grid row to align it wherever we want on the grid. And by the way, if you want to learn more about CSS grid layouts and see some creative techniques, feel free to check out my in-depth tutorials. The link is available in the description. Now let's move on and add some polish to the layout. First, we'll turn member details into a flex container so its content stays perfectly centered, and we'll keep it hidden by default. It should only become visible when the anchor tag enters either the hover state or the focus visible state. At the same time, the heading in the left box should make way for the member details. So by default, the heading stays visible, but we'll hide it whenever any anchor tag is hovered or focused. Then we only need to add some transitions to make the effect smooth and polished. The focus visible pseudo class makes sure that keyboard users can navigate the page easily without missing any interactions, a small but important step toward accessibility. We can also make this layout responsive by tweaking the grid configuration. Instead of 5 columns, it'll switch to 3 on small screen devices, and the heading area will stretch across 1 row and all 3 columns. And that's how you can combine grid layout with absolute positioning to place elements inside a grid container, even when they're not direct children of that grid. If you learned something new today, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Drop your questions or comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.